everyone. Let's just go ahead and get started. As usual, it's just so good to see everyone and have this time of fellowship. I'm so thankful for everyone in this book club. We are in week 7, so I will pass it over to Beth, who will open us up in prayer and get us started. Take it away, Beth.
Thanks, Tori, and welcome to everybody. It's so good to be back with everyone this week. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I have really come to look forward to our time together on Friday. It's just been a great time of fellowship. So let's open up this week with prayer, where we always need to start, right? We always start with Jesus first, and then we'll move into the discussion. I'm pretty excited about the discussion today. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for the beauty that you have provided us. Thank you for the inspiration that your creation gives us each and every day. From tiny little ladybugs to big skyscrapers, we know all of this earth is yours, and we praise you and thank you for giving us such a beautiful home to live in. Lord, we ask that you inspire us today to gain more insight, to give us the ability to help change our fellow people in our community, to understand that we need to take care of your creation. We need to love on this creation that you have provided for us, and we need to be leaders in advocating to protect that creation that you provided for us. Lord, bless this time together in fellowship, and thank you for us being able to get together in such a unique way. Amen. Okay, so today we are combining chapters 1 and 2. And the title of chapter 1 is An Accumulation of Coincidences. And chapter 2, it's not about polar bears. So we decided, since we were combining chapters 1 and 2, that we would have Paul and Mitch together. I don't know if we've ever explained this, but chapters Paul wrote, the even chapters Mitch wrote. So we'll let Paul start with chapter 1.
So, look, I started noticing changes, what I perceived to be changes in the weather patterns in the late 90s. And that's what really flagged my attention. And Mitch knows this. Some of you may realize this, but that's what got me off the dime, was that the weather, which had always been a symphony orchestra, was now increasingly playing out of tune. Things that I had not seen before. Not every day, not every week, but with greater frequency. And so that's what got me, as a meteorologist, I'm not a climate scientist, don't profess to be, but that's what got me to do a deep dive into the science, into the data, because I had my hands full just with the weather, day-to-day changes, and trying to predict the weather, and weather businesses on the side. But the more that I looked into this, it's like peeling an infinite onion, layer after layer. And the more I looked at the data, the more convinced I became in the late 90s and early 2000s that yes, the climate was in fact changing rapidly, and that the most likely reason was the additional greenhouse gases, the 40% increase in greenhouse gases since the start of the Industrial Revolution. We've almost doubled. So Albert Einstein has a quote that I included in the book: a man should look for what is and not what he thinks should be. And I would talk about this and people would say, hey, Paul, it's all politics. This is part of a broader agenda. And I would shake my head and say, well, that may be your takeaway. You're entitled to your opinion. You're not entitled to the facts. It's data, and the data is the data. And what struck me is that there are multiple threads of evidence. This is not dependent on one slim, tenuous thread of observations. And for me, it was an accumulation of coincidences, which I titled the chapter 1. because there was no overnight epiphany, and this had nothing to do with Al Gore's documentary. I started talking about this, connecting the dots, trying to connect the dots, long before Mr. Gore came out with a documentary, which I don't know. You know, I give Al Gore a lot of credit for speaking truth to power, knowing that there would be blowback, and there still is blowback. Sometimes I wonder if somebody like Senator McCain, who didn't dispute the science, if Senator McCain had come out with a documentary, would we be where we are today politically, where this is a hot potato? I don't know. But, you know, there are so many different threads of evidence, from increasing frequency of heat waves, oceans more acidic over time, ocean water levels obviously rising with time. That's not a theory. That's not dependent on a climate model. You can go out and measure the rising oceans. The frequency of flooding events. Again, one of the strongest attributions, the strongest confidence levels. Yes, people are experiencing more flooding more often. Inland flooding, flash flooding events on the increase, and also coastal flooding events on the increase. Ask anybody who lives in Annapolis or Charleston or Myrtle Beach or Miami Beach. The nuisance flooding on a clear day with no storms, just a full moon. These coastal communities are flooding with greater frequency. And the list goes on and on. What's happening in the Arctic? We can measure that with satellites. So I think we have turned a corner. I think a significant majority of Americans acknowledge that, yes, the climate is changing. There's still some who think it's a natural cyclical change. And to that I say, boy, I hope you're right, but it's one heck of a coincidence coming at a time when greenhouse gas levels have increased faster than ever measured. And again, we have pretty reliable data, ice core data, going back 800,000 years, ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica. So we have the data. CO2 is increasing, so is methane, and that corresponds with this upward blip in temperature. And I ask people, are you willing to gamble your child or grandchild's future on the fact that this is a cyclical change? We don't think twice about taking out insurance policies on our homes and our cars and our lives. But when it comes to climate, why wouldn't we take out an insurance policy? Just in case the vast, vast majority of scientists are right. And it's not 98%. It's like 98.9% of publishing climate scientists acknowledge that the Earth is warming. It's us. There are solutions. So I don't come at this from a standpoint of gloom and doom, Mitch. I usually start with solutions and then work backward. And people seem to be a little more accepting of the fact that the climate is changing, and yes, it's us, when they realize that we don't need a miracle technology to dig out from this. You may have seen the headlines in recent days, a 17% drop in CO2 because of the lack of traffic, you know, the pause, which nobody is wishing on the planet under the circumstances with this pandemic. But we have seen a significant drop-off in greenhouse gas emissions due to the pandemic and people staying home. 95% of flights have been curtailed worldwide. So we're getting a glimpse of a low pollution, clean energy future. And you wonder, is this an inflection point where people say, oh, yeah, I can see the mountains, I can see the hills, I can see the skyline. This is what it's supposed to be like, not the perpetual haze and pollution. And I was really struck by Mitch's chapters talking about the here and now, the short-term air pollution, and the number of premature deaths and the impacts from A to Z. And I think that's always a good place to start uh, when we talk about what's left of Eden, and we should be Christian stewards tending what's left of God's creation, and that we have a holy obligation to pay attention, keep our eyes open, and respond to the world the way it is, not the way maybe we think it should be.
Hey, Paul, just so you know, last week's call, I stole your line, but I did credit it to you, talking about that, that we are not hopeless or helpless. And that's a powerful line that Paul wrote that, I steal all the time because it's such a great line. But I think it is true. And, just about talking about solutions is, one of the things, if you want to think about, one of the responses of Europe to COVID-19 is to really rebuild in a green way. And can we think about that as well? Look at all the studies that are coming out of Europe right now. All their plans are addressing more clean energy, more limiting traffic, all the things, rebuilding the economy sustainably. They are going to be so far ahead of the United States because they're responding to COVID in a very positive way with positive changes. And maybe that's one thing that we can think about is how do we spur our businesses and our economy to really look forward instead of looking backward. And I think that's a real positive thing. We saw one of the largest solar arrays being commissioned on public land in Nevada introduced this week. All sorts of good things are happening. We just have to make it go faster. So sorry to interrupt, Paul.
No, I couldn't agree more. And yeah, the situation isn't hopeless, and we aren't helpless, and all of us have a voice. I would argue all of us have a ministry. And when people say, well, you're worshiping nature, Paul, that's not biblical. And I go, man, we're talking about God's creation. And no, I worship God. I worship his son. But I think we worship the Creator when we protect his creation and defend his children. Full stop. A lot of different ways to worship the Creator, but we've been loaned a gift. We have a holy obligation to care for that gift. What's interesting to me, and I know we're going to get into solutions down the road, but when I talk about my electric vehicle and how it's saving me money, how there's a return on investment, some of the conservatives, that I can see are nodding off when I'm talking about the science of climate change. They don't want to hear it, but they sit up a little straighter in their seats, and I can tell they're paying attention when I talk about electric and how I was skeptical. And it's good to come at everything from a position of skepticism. And at some point you reach a kind of a certain critical mass, you change your mind. It's okay to change your mind based on the data, based on the evidence. But to me, that's always fun, talking about my epiphany, and that, yeah, I as somebody who acknowledges we have a problem, I should be driving an electric vehicle. I should be driving less. I should be flying less. We can talk about those structural changes that all of us perhaps should be making. It's interesting too, with more people working from home. Again, is this an inflection point? It's going to be hard going back into the office, Mitch. I know you have the ability to work from home much of the time, but I know how often you get to DC, but you just wonder, this pandemic really is a touch point, an inflection point, and we're not going back to the way things were in January.
What I really wanted to talk about is the concept of it's not about polar bears. Neat is I had some really neat pictures of polar bears up. And let me give you a little secret. Why the polar bears became the iconic image of climate change was based on the research that was done by a lot of the big enviros that found out that polar bears were a very good, no, not Coca-Cola, that was part of it, but Coca-Cola probably used the same research. But the idea was that they found out that very progressive people who had lots of money loved the iconic image of a polar bear. So it was strictly, and is today, still used as a fundraising tool by the big enviros to raise money for their causes, which there's nothing wrong with that. But what I'd like to tell you today is that most evangelicals and most Christians aren't going to change their way of life over a polar bear. And I'd like to ask you, as one of the questions we're going to talk about in the small groups today, is would a polar bear cause you to change your way of life? We've done a lot of social science research on our messaging in EEN. And personally, as a pastor, one of the things that I took in is what those who have went to it call seminary in Christian counseling classes. I took a lot of classes on something called family systems theory. And basically what family systems theory is all about, it says that families and congregations and even communities, groups of people, tend to want to remain unbalanced. It's like the system of if you remember that they don't have too many of them anymore in playgrounds, but a teeter-totter. You know, they like to have that balance from one side to another. And unless something upsets or changes that balance that is a core value, they're not going to change. And so one of the things that we found out is very important to people are children. They're very important to me. I mean, how many of you don't either love your kids or your grandkids? And something that threatens your children is a really easy way to motivate people to act. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize what happens to children from pollution in the United States. Let me give you an example. Many of you know that I'm a member of the board of directors of the National Association of Evangelicals. Literally, just a few days before everybody got closed in from COVID, we had an NAE board meeting in Washington, D.C. And one of the speakers at the board meeting was the Surgeon General of the United States. And of course, he was talking about he didn't want to talk about COVID-19 because we won't talk about that administration was sort of denying its problems still at that point. But we started talking about the flu and how many people in the United States, struggle with the flu and looking for ways to do outreach that. And 20 to 30,000 people die every year from the typical flu. And then I happen to mention, you're very concerned about the flu. You're very concerned about other public health questions, but somewhere between 190 and 200,000 people die every year in the United States from pollution that is directly accountable to fossil fuels. And why aren't you spending, in fact, I asked the Surgeon General this question, why aren't you spending more money to address this public health concern about fossil fuels than you are worrying about the flu? And his answer was very simple. My administration has not given me the money to fight air pollution. They have given me money to fight the flu. Even though, on general terms, people dying from pollution are an order of magnitude greater, even in the United States. In fact, one of the surprising things that the Lancet study, if you're familiar with Lancet, Lancet's a British medical journal, probably one of the most respected medical journals in the world. And one of our board members, in fact, our chief medical advisor is a gentleman by the name of Dr. Phil Landrigan. He's actually not an evangelical, but he's a really dedicated Catholic. And he chaired this Lancet Commission on Pollution and Human Health that was published a couple years ago. And that study, which is a little bit out of date now, it's actually worse now, showed that all forms of pollution kill 9 million people around the world every year. And what's surprising about that, That's 3 times more people die from pollution than tuberculosis, AIDS, or malaria combined. And it's 10 times more people that die every year from every form of violence. People just haven't made that connection. And that's one of the things that we want to talk about today. Even in the United States today, it's imagined that it cost per citizen, per person in the United States, excuse me, not citizens, but residents of the United States, including children, $1,900 a person per year is the cost that it costs our society. Literally trillions of dollars, at least $350 billion, cost the economy in the death and life problems from pollution. Because pollution does a lot of things. PM 2.5 now, the small pieces of soot have been shown to exacerbate lungs, hearts, and even brain. In fact, even though people have challenged it a lot, Harvard came out with a study that's showing people that had compromised lungs from air pollution were greater at risk for COVID-19. But the CDC has said the same thing. And it only makes sense. If you have compromised a pulmonary system, respiratory diseases are going to make it worse. And so our belief and what we have found that works so well is finding out these impacts that impact people locally and helping them to understand that of how their children and their grandchildren are impacted. In fact, one of the things that I do quite often, and it was in the book, if I'm speaking in a local church or some type of Christian gathering, I will ask the simple question, how many people in this congregation have children or grandchildren that have asthma, ADHD, severe allergies, and somebody blank me out because I just went brain dead without my slides. It's the 4A system. It's
autism, allergies, ADHD, and asthma.
Thank you very much, Kyle, for helping me out. It is kind of funny to do that is that usually at least 60 or 70% of a congregation will stand up. And I say, if you're concerned about those allergies or those conditions in your children or your grandchildren, then you should be about creation care. Because 1 in 3 children in America suffer those conditions, and that 1/3 of those are directly linked to fossil fuels and petrochemicals. It's an epidemic. My center passage comes from John 10:10, that Jesus came to give us life and life abundantly. And if you look at the Greek versions of that word translated abundantly in life, it's not just about going to heaven. It's about a wholeness of life even here. Many people equate it to the life that was breathed into Adam at the very beginning of time. It's a holistic version of being healthy, having joy. And I argue very much that we are stealing that abundant life from people because of the way we're impacting their brains and their hearts and their minds from pollution. And that's why, for me, this is a pro-life issue. It's a very powerful issue that we're literally destroying the health and vitality of next generations. And it's just not on fossil fuels. One of the things I talk about in the book is that, we're seeing the lowest ability in American history of American males being able to reproduce. We're seeing all sorts of genetic abnormalities, I can't talk today, I'm brain dead, because of pollution and chemical things. Is if you really want to read a good book that's not about just fossil fuel pollution, but about how we're changing our own DNA from chemicals in this country, is a good friend of mine, Dr. Leonardo Transcendi. He's a professor at NYU's School of Medicine. Just wrote a book called Fatter, Sicker, Poorer. And it's all about the wrath of endocrine mimicking drugs that are literally changing our hormones in the United States?
We're going to really rely on your weather knowledge, Paul.
Uh-oh.
Someone asked what a bomb cyclone was.
Bomb cyclone, a rapidly intensifying storm, a storm that intensifies at an exceptional rate. And the faster these storms intensify, the stronger the winds have to spiral, have to blow into these partial vacuums. And so, yeah, a bomb cyclone, they tend to form on the East Coast, nor'easters, particularly intense nor'easters that strengthen rapidly, that play off a big contrast in temperature usually. Those are the ones that can produce exceptionally strong winds and even stronger surf, coastal flooding. Those are the ones that produce a disproportionate amount of damage. And by the way, one of the other tip-offs to warming is what's happening in the oceans. 93% of the additional warming from greenhouse gases, this chemical blanket, this man-made chemical blanket, 93% of that warming, Beth, is going into the oceans. The oceans are warmer earlier, the water, warm water deeper, and that's what fuels hurricanes. Hurricanes get their energy from warm water. The warmer the water, the deeper that warm water, the greater the potential for intensification. So in recent years, not only is hurricane season arriving earlier because the water is warming faster and sooner, but the hurricanes that do spin up, many of them are intensifying very rapidly right before they come ashore. We saw that with Hurricane Michael, the Florida Panhandle, other hurricanes, similar stories. So that's one of many different tip-offs that, yes, a warmer climate is showing up in multiple symptoms. So thank you for a good question.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Michael, the Gulf water was over 8 degrees warmer than the 20th century average when Michael came ashore. That's a lot of heat.
It's a lot of heat.
Yep.
So the next question is we know we have flooding in areas and we have droughts in other areas. And we've always had that historically, but like we're talking with hurricanes, the extremes are different. They seem to be more intense. Can you address sort of why that's happening?
Sure. I mean, you warm up the atmosphere, it's basic physics. You increase the amount of water vapor, the amount of water that's floating overhead. So roughly a 2-degree Celsius increase corresponds with about 7-8% more water vapor. So you have a greater source of significant precipitation. When it does rain, it is raining harder. And we're seeing more of these days with 2, 3, 5 inches of rain. You know, what used to be a 1 in 500 year flood in many areas is now a 1 in 50 year flood. Ask residents of Houston. I mean, I think they've seen 3 or 4 500 year floods in the last 3 or 4 years. So at some point, you question what is a 500 year flood? The definition is changing. So a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. That's translating into more intense rains. And again, that's not a climate model. That's going out and measuring rain in a rain gauge. And where we see the biggest increase is New England, about a 70% increase in these extreme rainfall events, followed by the Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Mid-Atlantic, where again, more people are seeing flooding more often. So yes, have we always had floods and droughts since the creation? Absolutely. But looking back at the data, and again, we can go back not just a few hundred years, we can go back millions of years and use proxy data to see when there was in fact drought and flood. What's happening now is unprecedented in terms of the increase, especially in flooding. Certain parts of the world, we're seeing an increase in drought, but the overriding signal right now is more flooding east of the Rockies. West of the Rockies, California, certainly, you know, a tendency for drier weather. So I'll just stop there.
So one more question and then we'll break out to small groups. And I'm probably going to mess up this word, but it was a very intelligent question. So what are the 3 to 5 anthropogenic global warming denial arguments you get, and how do you respond?
The climate has always changed, Paul. How is this any different? And I talk about the increase in greenhouse gases. Nobody disputes that there are more man-made greenhouse gases. We can actually track the isotope of CO2 that comes from fossil fuels versus natural CO2. Yeah, if there wasn't CO2, we wouldn't be here. No argument. But there's an optimal level of CO2 that has allowed civilization to flourish over the last few thousand years. Right now, we're well outside of that optimal level. And we can show that this additional CO2, based on the isotope, is coming from fossil fuel sources. So it's not natural, it's man-made. And I tell people, look, maybe, is it the sun? Let's check the data. No, it's not the sun. Solar irradiance is dropping slightly or holding steady. It's not an increase in sunlight. Is it volcanoes? No. Millions of years ago, when we had planetary volcanoes all belching additional methane and greenhouse gases, yes, that warmed the atmosphere. Right now, the state of Florida produces more man-made CO2 and methane than all the world's volcanoes. It's not volcanoes. The most likely explanation is, in fact, CO2. The other pushback I get is that God would never allow this to happen. A sovereign God would not allow this to happen. And look, I think I said this before. God created the car. We're the ones with our hand on the steering wheel. And he blessed us with the wisdom to make wise decisions, good, solid, sound, long-term decisions, or short-term, selfish, greedy decisions. And he gave us the freedom to be able to make good choices. And fossil fuels were all we had for the longest time. And it got us to where we are today, but it's not sustainable. In terms of other denial talking points, CO2 is plant food, more CO2 is better. Paul, don't you agree? You know, if a little bit of CO2 is good, more CO2 is better. You say no. That's not the case. There's an optimal range. And in fact, plant yields actually go down at some point with additional CO2 in the air. Too much oxygen, things begin to spontaneously combust. So again, optimal range. But some people, no amount of evidence is going to change their minds. They just dig in their heels. And I guess the older I get, the less patience I have for that. I think a significant percentage of people do still respond to evidence and data. If you don't respond to evidence and data, I don't know, it's going to be a short conversation.
That's a great point to end on. Tori, if you'll go on and send us to small groups, we'll see everyone there.